Hello and welcome to the video today on job order costing. So today we're going to talk about job order costing, as I said, and job order costing is covered in Chapter 2 of your textbook, and process costing is covered in Chapter 3 of your textbook. Job order costing and process costing are both types of product costing systems. They are both types of product costing systems. And so that what we mean by a product costing system is a system that helps us to allocate direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead to the products that we make. Okay, so again, we're going to be focusing on job order costing system in these series of lecture videos. So before we can go into talk about job order costing system and actually get into the way that it works, we first have to define product costs versus period costs. And so when we talk about manufacturing costs, we also can call those product costs. And so what we mean by manufacturing costs or product costs are all costs associated with making a product that we make. So there are three categories. There's direct materials, which I abbreviate DM, direct labor, DL, MOH, manufacturing overhead. So again, when we talk about manufacturing costs, we're talking about all costs, and I'll say over here, closely associated with making the final product. So if we make a table, that's what we make, that's what our company does. All the costs closely associated with making that table, such as the wood, the glue, the screws, the people that we have to pay to assemble the table, which would be the direct labor, and then of course the utilities and rent that are on the factory in which we make the table. That would be the manufacturing overhead. So let's go ahead and talk about these three classifications. So I'll say DM, which is direct materials. We'll say all costs of materials and parts that can be easily traced to the product that we make. Okay, so I'll just abbreviate their product. So all costs of materials and parts that can be easily traced to the product that we make. Direct materials is a direct variable. It's a variable cost. It's a direct cost. And so what I mean by direct cost, remember we talked about that in Chapter 1, a direct cost in this context. Remember we said in Chapter 1, direct costs versus indirect costs. Direct costs can be easily traced to the cost object. Indirect costs cannot be easily traced to the cost object. But we did say one cost could be direct, and it could be indirect in another context, depending upon the cost object. But when I'm talking about the cost object with reference to product costing systems, I mean the products that we make. So when I say direct costs here, I mean direct, these costs can be easily traced to the products that we make. So the cost object is the product that we make. Again, if we make a table, then it's a table. Okay? So an example of this would be, we could say wood, we could say steel, for example, would be examples of direct materials. The next one that we're going to do, and again, coming back to this classification, direct materials are a direct, it's considered a variable cost. It's a direct variable product cost. Okay? It's a direct variable product cost. Direct labor, we could say all labor costs easily traced to the product. Okay? All labor costs easily traced to the product. So again, this is a direct variable product cost. Direct labor is a direct variable product cost. Okay? An example would be assembly line labor. Okay? And then the last one we have over here is manufacturing overhead. You can say all other costs of production of making the final good that cannot be easily traced to the products that we make. Okay? And there are three subcategories of manufacturing overhead. The first one is indirect labor. So this would be, for example, we could say, we'll define that as labor costs not easily traced to the product. So an example of indirect labor would be production supervisor salary. Okay. And then we could say over here that our next one would be indirect materials. And we can define that as insignificant raw materials costs not easily traced, okay, to the product. And again, it's easily traced to the product. So insignificant raw materials costs not easily traced to the product. An example, we could say glue, we could say nails, okay. Those would be examples of indirect materials. And then finally over here we can say other indirect costs. So we could say rent on factory, and we could say insurance on factory. That'd be another example. Okay. We could even say property taxes on factory. We could say depreciation. Okay. Depreciation would be another example. Depreciation on the factory. Depreciation on equipment. It's not easily traced to the products that we make, okay? Because that equipment can be used to make a lot of different types of products. Okay. So if we're thinking about applying this to making a table, we make this table that I'm using, this desk that I'm using right over here to write these notes on. We could say direct materials would be the wood to make the desk. The direct labor would be the assembly line labor that we actually have to pay to assemble the desk. And then what we say with our indirect labor is we could have a production line supervisor in the factory who's watching over all the assembly line workers. His or her salary would be considered indirect labor. Okay? In indirect labor here, this we're going to consider an indirect, but if they're paid by salary, right, that would be a fixed product cost. Okay? So we continue on with our making table example over here with indirect materials, insignificant raw materials. So if we have any glue or nails that we actually have to have to assemble the table here in our factory, that would be considered indirect materials. And this would be considered an indirect variable product cost. Okay? Indirect variable product cost. And then we can say other. And then looking at these two, these are certainly fixed costs. So we could say indirect fixed product with those two examples. And of course, even with depreciation as well, that would be considered a fixed cost. So this one, it depends upon the other, because that's kind of a catch-all, whether it be considered fixed or variable. But the examples that I've given over here are certainly considered fixed. Okay. So again, getting back to the example of making a table, the factory in which we make the table, the rent that we have to pay on that factory would be considered other manufacturing overhead. The insurance that we actually have to pay on that factory would be considered other manufacturing overhead. And it's considered an indirect cost because that rent and then that insurance, it can be directly traced to the factory, but it's indirect. It cannot be easily traced to the products that we make. So therefore, it's considered an indirect cost because remember the cost object that we're talking about are the products that we make. Okay? So I'll go on to the next page right over here. I have some more examples of common manufacturing overhead costs, indirect factory labor, indirect materials, overtime premium, so on and so forth. I just want to highlight a few things over here. Anytime you see the word factory, factory, plant, factory, okay, or you see production facility, those all mean product costs, okay? That means that they are product costs. It means they're closely associated with making the final product, so it's considered a product cost as opposed to what we're going to talk about here in a second, a period cost. These are not period costs. Those are product costs, which means that they eventually show up in cost of goods sold, and then they are eventually pushed down to inventory as well. Okay? So again, if I give you test questions and I start to say, is this a product or period cost, you have to look for the keywords of factory, plant, production. Those are all product costs. They are not period costs. Okay? So let's go on to the next page right over here. When we talk about period costs. When we talk about period costs, catch up over here, we can say our definition of a period cost or non-manufacturing cost, we can say all costs not closely associated with making the final product. So all costs not closely associated with making the product. Okay? And there's two subclassifications. We could have marketing and selling costs and administrative costs. We can define marketing and selling costs as those costs associated with securing and filling customer orders. Okay? So you could say, for example, any salesperson's salaries, salesperson's commissions, any cost that we would incur to ship the product to the customer, that would be considered a marketing and selling cost, which is a subtype of a period cost. Okay? We could also say depreciation of office sale or depreciation on salesperson's cars. Right? Sometimes salespeople get a car, and that depreciation on that car would be considered a marketing and selling cost. So we talk about administrative costs. This is the second type of period cost. We can say costs associated with the general management of the firm. Okay? So what an example of this would be considered a CEO's salary, or the salary of the CFO. Or we could also say utilities on corporate headquarters. If it were utilities on the factory, that would be considered manufacturing overhead, but because it's utilities on corporate headquarters, it's considered a period cost. So why don't we go through here and classify, just do a little bit of practice here classifying some of these costs. So the first one we can look at is insurance on factory building. Keyword is factory. That's manufacturing overhead, and again, that would be considered, quote unquote, the third subclassification of manufacturing overhead of other manufacturing overhead. Salaries of machine maintenance personnel, because it's maintenance personnel, it's going to be difficult to trace their salaries to a specific product because those machines could be used to make a lot of different products. So we're going to consider that manufacturing overhead as well. Sales representatives commissions, sales, that's marketing and selling, that's a period cost. Transportation costs for units sold, that's those costs that we incur to get the customer the order, so that would be considered a period cost. Rent on factory building, factory, manufacturing overhead. Transportation costs on raw materials we're going to include in the direct materials costs. Screws connecting seats to legs, that would be indirect materials, so that's manufacturing overhead. Fuel costs of heating administrative offices, keyword there is administrative, which means it's a period cost. Property taxes on the factory, again, that would be considered manufacturing overhead. And then I'll just go ahead and keep that just so we can go through and finish the rest of them. Depreciation on salesperson's cars, that's a period cost. Salaries of workers putting the stools together, that would be considered direct labor right over here. And then the wood used to make the stools would be considered our direct materials. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. I'm going to end this video, and then we'll come back in the second video and continue on with talking about why it's so important to make sure that we classify product and period costs correctly, and then do some more quick check problems as well. Thank you.